Chapter 6. Lay aloft. He loud exhorting them his people bade, hand brisk the tackle. They, obedient, reared the pine tree mast, which in its socket deep they lodged. Then strained the cordage, and with thongs well twisted, drew the shining sail aloft. Homer. Set fore and aft sails. It was the deep rolling bass of the chief mate issuing the first command to the crew. So far, the big steam tug up ahead had done all the work except catting the bark's anchors, a job which seemed to get itself done without command. Set fore and aft sails, thought Bert. That ought to be easy. Let's see. The fore and aft sails are jibs, staysails, and spanker. Yachting in books taught me that much anyhow. Now we'll see how it's done. Hi. The horse growl at his elbow swung the boy around to see old Smith heading for the poop, apparently ignoring him. Was that hi meant for him? He followed old Smith and half a dozen others up the steps to the poop, his eyes trying to take in 100 details at once. By the starboard or windward rail opposite the charthouse stood Captain Hagerstrom, his roving glance seeming to take in nothing nearer than the red-hulled lightship half a mile to windward. But in reality, Bert surmised seeing everything. A strong but kindly face, with white hair showing beneath his soiled and battered felt hat, a man of perhaps 50. He wore a flannel shirt, corduroy trousers which showed signs of much wear, and heavy laborer's shoes. Bert had no time to wonder that the master of a tall and stately sailing vessel should dress so. Someone thrust a rope into his hands, and he pulled with the rest. Hand over hand, said a voice, and the heavy canvas of the Lego mutton spanker slid steadily upward to the clinking of the blocks and with the weird sing-song chants of the men who had called for hand over hand. The tension on the halyard increased as the whole weight of the sail began to be felt. The men fell to swinging in rhythm, taking their cadence from the grunted heave, oh, ee, ah, gee, up of the chanter. Come up, said a voice, while Bert, at the tail of the line, wondered what come up meant. The men in front of him released their holds. Come up, the voice barked, and at the same instant the rope was jerked out of Bert's hands. As the men fell back, he saw that the man who had chanted their time was belaying the halyard, while another was straining on the vertical part of the halyard before it passed through the deck block to keep it from slipping back. The spanker was set. A glance forward showed Bert that the jibs, too, were set. He started toward the steps with the others, his eyes sweeping the main deck below. Clank! One of his boots struck a block on the deck, knocking it against its ring bolt. He stumbled, caught himself, and flushed crimson with shame. He would be branded a landlubber. Only 2 men noticed, but these 2 looked him up and down as though they now saw him for the first time. One smiled brightly, the other sneered. You got a big feet, said the smiling one. You wrecked the sheep. Well, look at our little Lord Fauntleroy, all dressed up for a walk in the park, sneered the other. They must have raided a baby farm to get you, huh? Horribly aware of his clothes, Bert made his way to the main deck, vowing to get others as speedily as possible. Ahead of him were the broad, hunched shoulders of old Smith, and somehow he found them reassuring. His eyes half blinded by tears of anger and chagrin, he grasped the line that the old man passed him and pulled with all his strength. In a moment, the staysail was set. The boy tried to forget his insults by searching his memory for the name of the sail they had just hoisted. The heavy wire stay which carried the sail ran from the deck, just abaft the mizzenmast, to the point where the lower shrouds fastened to the jiggermast, the jigger top. Therefore, the sail must be the jigger topmast staysail. Next time he'd remember where the halyard belayed, and the sheets. All fore and aft sails were set now, and the men lounged idly about the decks. Also lounging about the decks, and far outnumbering the crew, was the motley crowd that made up the China gang. All races were present, apparently, except the Chinese. But for the time being, Bert had eyes only for the ship and his fellow seamen. Of the seamen, around a dozen were staggering drunk, and as many more were handling themselves with difficulty. Just so many less hands to do the work aloft, Bert thought, as he stood leaning on the pin rail at the foot of the mizzen mast. "They will pee all right in a day or two," a low voice said, and Bert turned to see the taciturn German of the meerschaum pipe standing beside him. He was smoking now, however, a big clay pipe instead of the meerschaum. "It is always so when we leave port." Bert opened his mouth to ask a question. "Set squaresails!" boomed the mate. "Lay aloft there!" Bert glanced around unconsciously for Old Smith. He saw him moving toward the mizzen-mast shrouds and followed. Up the weather shrouds, on the three masts that carried square sails, went the men, choosing whichever mast happened to be closest, while the second and third mates tried to apportion the men evenly. To Bert's surprise, the first men in the rigging were the drunks, who a moment before had been hanging to each other and the bulwarks and deckhouse for support. Through his mind flashed the thought that they would surely be killed. But the knowledge that he himself was going aloft was, for the moment, the thing of greatest importance. Old Smith swung himself deliberately from the planks over the deckload to the top of the bulwarks and began to climb. His pulse beating a tattoo in his temples, Bert followed. The solid feel of the iron bars was reassuring. Why, this was just like climbing a ladder. Pretend it was a ladder. And just above his hands were the heels of Old Smith. Surely an athletic boy could climb anywhere that an old man could go. Why was Old Smith so grouchy? It wouldn't hurt him to lighten up a bit, since they were to be partners. Bert's arms and legs worked steadily. He knew better than to look down. Directly in front of his eyes was the great steel tube that was the main yard. No, this was the mizzenmast, so that would be the crossjack yard. Would they stop here? Perhaps for the first time aloft. But Old Smith's heels went up steadily, the shrouds so big around with their parceling that Bert could barely touch thumb to fingertip drew together. His breath came in gasps. 60, 70 feet up, almost at a run. Surely the old man couldn't keep that up much longer. Slanting his eyes upward, Bert kept them fixed on Old Smith's heels. He would go wherever those heels went, or die trying. Suddenly, to his horror, the heels stopped going upward and toward the mast and began going upward and sharply away from the mast. Bert jerked his head still farther upward and found himself gazing into the middle of his partner's back, while the old man climbed steadily on the underside of a ladder that sloped sharply outward. The boy froze to the rigging. He had forgotten the futtock shrouds. After seconds that seemed like eternities, the upper half of Old Smith's body disappeared above a horizontal semicircular steel plate, the mizzen top, followed immediately by his legs. Bert's first thrill of fear past, he steeled himself to follow. After all, the outward sloping part of the climb was no more than 6 feet. "Move on, pretty. Don't you see the no parking signs? You ain't out walking in the woods now." Bert knew who was below him without looking down. Anyway, he couldn't look down. Keeping his eyes rigidly on the next handle-hold above, he climbed. He hung over space. Now his eyes were even with the steel plate, and his hands were reaching for the shrouds above it, the shrouds that rose from its outer edge to slope gradually toward the mast again, far above him. Now his body was half above the plate, while his legs swung inward below it. His hands gripped the shrouds so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Now he had one foot on the mizzentop, now the other. How solid the steel plate felt. If only he could stop there. But Old Smith was 10 feet above him now, and still climbing. And above Old Smith were other men, all going up, 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 to where the shrouds joined the mast again, and a third set started upward. The climbing was not so easy now, for the topmast shrouds, less solid than the lower shrouds, swayed and jerked from the shifting weights of the men. Bert held his body rigid, fighting against the swing of the shrouds, breathing heavily. He passed 2 yards, close together, on which several men were already busy. Bert tried to name the yards, but failed. His mind, like his hands, clung to the swaying, jerking rigging, while his eyes stayed glued on the heels of Old Smith. He gained on the heels. Was the old man slowing up? Again, the shrouds narrowed, drew so close between them. Old Smith was swinging outward again, around the topmast cross trees. Bert followed. It was not so hard to pass the futtock shrouds this time, particularly because the wooden beams of the cross trees were not as wide as the steel plate of the mizzen top below. Also, Bert was forgetting the height, forgetting the deck below. He breathed more easily, despite the continuous climb. Partway up the top-gallant shrouds, the third set above the deck, Old Smith swung his body to the left, stepped from the shrouds to the foot rope under the lower of the two closely parallel yards, and began moving outward toward the windward end of the yard. With his last glance upward, Bert saw that there was just 1 yard above them. That would be the royal. Then he noticed that one man was ahead of Old Smith on his yard, and realized with a start that the man had been too drunk to stand on deck unsupported a few minutes before. Now he was sitting astride the yard, starting to coil the gasket in his hands as he unwound it from the furled sail. He began singing in time to the swaying of his body. "Oh, Molly dear, and did ya hear the news that's going round?" Bert's feet found the wire foot rope, his hands clamped around the iron bar that ran along the top of the yard, and he moved carefully after Old Smith. In a moment, the drunken sailor astride the yard passed the coil of line to Old Smith, who continued the unwinding. Bert heard Old Smith breathing heavily and noticed that his movements were slow. Going aloft was young man's work. Still straddling the lower of the 2 yards, the drunken sailor began unrolling the gasket from the yard above him. Seeing Bert watching him, he broke off his song. "Hello, youngster," he said genially. "You look kind of green around the gills. First time aloft, huh? Well, you stick close to Nick Previson. I'll see to you don't fall off. I'm old sailor, I am. Drunk or sober, workin' lofts all same to me. Nick Previson, that's my name. Call me Nick. Old sailor I am, and Captain Tom's best skipper ever sailed with." Bert wanted to laugh, or did he want to cry? He wasn't sure which. Old Smith was holding the coil of line toward him. He must let go with one hand to take the line. Pressing his body close to the steel tube, he loosened the fingers of his left hand and took the coil. Having something to do gave him confidence, and at once he began passing the coil over and under the yard and closely furled sail, as he had seen the others do, using both hands for the work. A feeling of triumph passed over him. He was aloft, doing sailor's work. The first time he had left the deck, he had gone up to work on the highest sail but one. As he worked, he shot swift glances over the ocean. From here, the sea seemed but gently rippled. Ripples that flashed bright blue in the sunlight. A glimpse astern showed him the fading hills on either side of the Golden Gate. To windward, the jagged rocks of the Farallones rising from the water. To leeward, the smoke of 2 or 3 steamers. Ahead, nothing but blue, empty sea. Opposite him, on the main yards, other men were going through the same motions as he and Nick and Old Smith. The familiar gulls wheeled close to the men in the lofty top works of the Queen of Asia. Bert was glad he was going to sea, glad and triumphant. Nick passed Bert on the yard and went on up to loose the royal, singing Irish Molly as he went. Old Smith waited while Bert finished the second coil, made it fast, and prepared to swing his body back to the shrouds as the work on the yards seemed to be ended. Forward he saw the fore and main lower topsails drop into place and fill with the gentle northwesterly breeze, while one at a time the upper topsail yards crept slowly up the masts to the puffing of the donkey engine on deck until those sails, too, were set. The rustle of canvas below him drew his attention downward to where the mizzen lower topsail was beginning to belly in the wind. From the sail his glance wavered to the deck. Fascinated and astonished, he stared at the ridiculously narrow deck of the vessel below him. Those Lilliputian figures moving about. Could they be men? Could such pitifully tiny creatures possibly be men? They were more like insects. What if he loosened the grip of his hands and went sailing through the air down among those insects that were men? Perhaps he would let go. "Look up!" Instinctively, Bert obeyed the growled command. Instantly, the world appeared in its proper proportions again. There was Old Smith, a full-sized man, standing by his side. Bert attempted a smile, but it was a dismal failure. His head felt light. Old Smith laid a hand on his arm. How good it felt, that hand. "Steady," said the old man, and his eyes met Bert's. "Rest a minute. and then go over into the shrouds. Don't look below your feet." What a fool he was being, Bert thought, to lose his nerve after the work was all done. But old Smith was human, after all, and he was all right now, after that one moment of horrible nausea. Under his feet, one of the sails he had helped to loose dropped into place, and the yard in front of his eyes began to move slowly upward to the creaking of the heavy chain halyard. Most of the men were in the shrouds now, going down. Bert reached for the shrouds. Then he paused to wait for a man to pass. As the man moved downward, he came face to face with the waiting boy, who glanced at him casually, then stared round-eyed at a hard, sullen, and badly pock-marked face. At sight of the staring boy, the man's eyes narrowed, almost concealing their gleam of hatred. For a time, no longer than the flicker of an eyelid, he paused, then continued on his way. The man with the pock-marked face. Without a thread of evidence against his fellow seaman, Bert knew him for his twin sister's assailant and the man who had brought the deadly ship model to Hargrave. There might be 2 or a dozen or 100 sailors in San Francisco with pock-marked faces, but Bert would have staked his life that this was the one who concerned him. Completely oblivious now to the 140 feet of space between himself and the deck, Bert swung into the rigging and began his descent.